Alright, our first video we talked about the Azure platform and kind of the hierarchy, management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, resources. We talked about Azure resources being represented as JSON objects and why that's important. And then we talked a little bit about tagging. Now we are going to get into Azure Policy settings itself and an overview of what Azure Policy is and why. So some of the topics we cover here are going to be what it's used for, why we use Azure Policy. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the examples that you could use Azure Policy for right out of the gate. We're going to take a look at the Azure Policy objects themselves. There are a few different types that I've listed here. We'll go into each type, what it is, and kind of how they relate to everything. And then the last thing we'll talk about here are I have a couple links that I'll reference as far as understanding policy definitions and effects. I'm going to link those in the description below, probably for this video, and when we're talking about the policy object management later on. We'll actually get into looking at the structure. And then I also want to spend some time talking about when Azure policies apply, because as part of the deployment process, when you're creating a resource in Azure and it creates a deployment, Azure policies, depending on the effect that the policy is configured for, will apply at different points in that deployment process, and we will get different results. And that depends on how the Azure policy itself is written. So we're going to spend a little time talking about that because it's good to have an understanding from an administrator's perspective so that you have a better concept of how the policies are going to interact with resources. Switching here to our browser. Let's pull up the Azure Policy screen, which you can get to in the search bar by typing policy right there. And you'll notice the nice logo that I've got here and on every video here because I like the Azure Policy logo, strangely enough. Let's first talk quick about some scenarios that you'd use Azure Policy for. And this will help give you kind of an understanding, hopefully, of how it fits into everything else in Azure. I like to think of Azure policies as essentially the group policy mechanism of Azure. If you haven't picked up on it yet, I like to reference back to Active Directory for a lot of things because I'm familiar with it and because there's a lot of concepts that carry over. So hopefully you're familiar with it. When I say group policy, you understand what that means. Essentially, they can do a number of things, but they're used to, one, enforce the resource standards that you want to require in your environment. Some examples of that being, if you want to make sure that you are always interacting with an Azure PaaS service on HTTPS and you don't allow HTTP because you want that encrypted connection to your resources, you can make sure you have Azure policies configured for every resource to require HTTPS. Similar to that, we're going to use as an example later on when we're talking about working with policies and the objects, we're going to set a policy that requires TLS 1.2 because we don't want to allow older versions of TLS. So there are resource settings and standards that you can control using Azure Policy, either built-in ones or existing ones. Another really great use case that I'm actually doing on the platform here for myself is you can prevent specific resource types from being created. If you are giving someone the freedom to create resources in Azure, by default, that applies to anything. Meaning, if they can create a resource, they can go ahead and spin up an entire AKS cluster. They can build a function app that then can interact with anything in the environment. They can create identities that they can then grant permissions and assign to different things. Well, permissions require owner rights, but regardless, they have a lot of freedom that comes when you give them the rights to create objects. They get a lot of freedom in the portal to do a whole bunch of things and probably not a lot of things that you want them to do. So you can limit that as an administrator to only allow them to create a certain set or type of resources, meaning I'm giving you the rights to create resources, but I only want you to be able to create a storage account, a key vault, and maybe an app service plan, an app service so you can run your website. But outside of that, I don't want you creating anything else. You can define that in a policy to restrict the resource types. That's a very common use case. The other thing that is really, really common, probably the number one reason to use Azure Policy, as we talked about in the previous video, tagging to enforce tag standards, to enforce tag inheritance, that sort of thing. So those are three really common use cases for why you'd use Azure Policy. And then as an overview of what policy itself is used for, when you apply policies, they will control settings, but then you're also given this screen here where you can monitor to validate that the resources that exist in your tenant are also compliant with those policies. You might be thinking, if it's group policy and you're enforcing certain standards, won't resources all automatically comply? And the short answer is no, they will not. We'll get into that a little bit, but you're always probably going to be dealing with non-compliance in some way, shape, or form for a variety of reasons. So your Azure Policy portal that we have up here will give you a compliance report and allow you to drill down and identify resources that are not compliant, and then you can either choose to remediate them or otherwise. So that's kind of the main reasons for Azure Policy. Now, there are a number of different policy object types that we'll talk about here, because it's good to understand from an administrator's perspective of what they are. We're going to start by talking about initiatives and definitions. Now, as I'm talking about this, we'll talk about definitions first, but whenever I talk about initiatives, you might also hear me use the word policy sets, which will make sense in a little bit. But let's change this to policy. And essentially, a definition or policy is a single defined set of properties that you want to control. And let's point out a couple of things about the definitions listed here. So these are all definitions. They have this little tan icon here, and it represents a single setting that you're trying to control. Now, this is a custom, so I'm going to ignore this. There's a static one as well, but let's focus on built-in ones. And we've already set the filter to be policies. But the main thing to point out here is there's a category that can be associated with every policy. If it's a built-in policy, the category is already set for you. If you customize it, you have the ability to set the category yourself. So what that category is the actual resource type that these policies apply to. If I set my category to, let's uncheck all, and let's set it to storage, which will probably be my example for most things because storage accounts are simple. If I apply that, you can see all of the different policy settings that are available to manage with Azure Policy for storage accounts. You'll notice a couple here: secure transfer of data, enforce blob versioning, so you can see if something changes, you can go back to a previous version, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of different settings that are available, and all of these are built-in policies, meaning I didn't have to load them from anywhere. They already existed, and they are available for me to apply out of the box. Now, if I switch this to also enable initiatives, and I switch my category back to all here, you'll notice that I have a whole bunch of objects that have this little green bar at the bottom. What that icon means, and what the definition type initiative means, is that's not a single setting you're trying to control. That is actually an object that has a collection of all those individual definitions. So a policy definition is a single setting that you're trying to control. A policy initiative is a collection of definitions that you want to then apply. We're going to get into a little bit into more of the definitions or initiatives and what components come with that, because it gives you a little bit different view and allows you to customize the information you're having when you're looking at compliance. But for our intents here, initiatives are just a collection of definitions. And as I mentioned, I might use the word policy set to reference initiatives. That's because when you're working with it as code, policy set is the term they use, which is easier to say than initiatives, and it's the same thing. It's a set of definitions, right? The next object type, which is a little bit obscure in the portal, but makes more sense once you start working with this from a code perspective, is you have what are called assignments. Now, if you are assigning a policy definition to your resource group or your management group, you might just think, okay, I have the definition and I've got the resource I assign it to, and that's it. Well, that's not exactly true. The assignment itself is an object that is represented in the portal. So all of these little blue icons are assignments, and it's good to think of assignments as objects because they have their own set of properties that are affiliated with them. Essentially, If you have a definition that requires a parameter, meaning one of the storage accounts policies was require a minimum version of TLS, meaning it has to be at least TLS, and you can define that minimum version as a parameter in the definition. When you assign that, the assignment has that parameter value, so you specify I'm assigning this definition to this location, and for my parameter I want the minimum TLS version to be 1.1. So anything greater than 1.1 is okay. That's part of the assignment, not the definition or who you assigned it to. So it's good to consider your assignments as their own resource from everything else. A couple other resource types you have listed here that aren't really going to be as common is you have exemptions. I probably don't have any yet because that's a small lab environment, but exemptions are you saying that a certain resource or resource group or some other identifier is exempt from a policy you've defined. So if you have that allowed resource type policy that I referenced earlier, and you say you're only allowed to make storage accounts and key vaults, and someone creates a resource group and they actually have a need to create something else and it's approved by you, you can go create an exemption to your allowed resource type policy for that resource group so that they are allowed to then create resources. Exemptions can be difficult to manage. We'll talk about that later, but essentially exemptions are exactly what they sound like. They're an exemption to a policy you have applied so that you can get around that for some reason. The last thing that they've got that I'll call out is what are called remediations. Remediations are when you want to retroactively go back and fix objects that are non-compliant. There's a whole other set of configurations there, and the remediations themselves aren't really objects, but they create remediation tasks, and I just want to call that out as it's another piece of policies for you to understand. All right, the last thing I want to get into here was talking about when Azure policies actually apply. This is going to be a little obscure, but let's switch back to our resource group here, and we'll go to deployments, and let me pull up a deployment here. I actually don't know what all of these are, but we'll pull this up. Okay, when you create a resource in Azure, it uses a deployment of some sort to facilitate that creation. So I want to create a storage account. It's going to create a deployment for that storage account. And Azure policies apply at different stages during this deployment. So let's first talk about the fact that Azure policies only apply as far as if you're using them to control things. So you want to block resources from being created that don't meet your standards, or you want to modify resources as they're being created to make sure that settings are set the way you want them to. Those only apply when resources are created. And that's really important to know. So if you have a whole bunch of resources that already exist in your environment and you are retroactively going back and applying Azure policies, the resources that exist will not be affected by the policies that you are creating. However, after resource creation, Azure policies do compliance checks. And a compliance check is taking your policy, taking the resources that exist, and making sure that the resources that exist line up with your policy and are compliant. And they will either report their status as compliant or non-compliant. And that is when you go back to the Azure policy portal and look at compliance, and then you can do things to either go back to those resources and manually configure them to match what your policies are, or you can use remediation tasks in some scenarios to fix the settings on those resources that are not compliant. However, that comes with its own set of caveats that we will talk about more when we get into the policy definition video. But for the sake of knowing when these apply, it's good to have an understanding of what are called Azure policy effects. Give me a second to pull up some documentation here. All right, this is a document that Microsoft has written more for people who are working on developing their own Azure policies, but it is a really good in-depth article that goes over policy effects, and we're going to kind of touch on it on a high level because we don't need to get too far into details for this, but it does really help us understand how and when these apply. So there's a couple of effects that I want to call out specifically that we'll use for example without getting into everything. Those are going to be audit if not exists, deny, and then modify. Start with deny because this is a good one to build off of. Policies that have a deny effect oftentimes can also, it's optional. You can either set the policy to deny or audit because they do the same thing. Deny policies will require a parameter is set as specified, and if not, it will block the resource from being created. So going back to the example where we want to enforce HTTPS on an object, if you have a deny policy that requires that, when you go to create the resource, I believe it's on the review and create screen in the portal, before you even get to the deployment screen, you will be blocked saying that this resource does not meet the requirements from Azure Policy and you can't create it. Now, if you flip that so it's an audit policy instead of deny, it will check that there is compliant, but it will not block you. And then after the resource is created, it will show up immediately in the Azure Policy console under as being non-compliant because it failed that audit check. So audit essentially checks but doesn't enforce. Deny checks and blocks if it doesn't meet it. Now, similar to audit if not exists is specifically for checking for settings that can't exist on the resource until after that resource is created. So by definition, if you have an effect that is audit if not exists, then it cannot be set to deny because the resource has to be created before that setting is even available to set. I don't know if this is an accurate example, but the one that comes to mind as an illustration is when you create a storage account. You create the storage account, create the settings, and then in order to create, put actual storage in there, if it's a blob storage account, you have to first create a storage container. If you had some sort of setting on the storage container, you would have to use an audit if not exists setting to check for that parameter. And that's because by definition, a container cannot exist until after the storage account has been created. So because the storage account has to exist before the container exists, you would have to check for it with an audit if not exists policy, because it's a policy that applies to something that isn't ever going to exist until the resource, its parent resource, exists first. So when you're thinking of order, it can't block it at resource creation because the resource needs to exist first. So it has to audit it after the fact. So hence audit if not exists policy. Now, the other one I was going to call out is modify, and a modify policy is exactly like what it sounds. The effect actually changes a setting on a resource. So going back to the require HTTPS example, and this could be on any resource. If I have a modify policy that sets it to require HTTPS, so like let's say you have a required HTTPS checkbox, and you have a modify policy that checks the box, it's set to true. It requires HTTPS. And you have that applied at the same time and place as the deny policy that blocks a resource from being created if that box isn't checked. What would happen in the order, and this goes back to knowing when policies apply, you go to the portal, you create your resource, that box is not checked. You are not requiring HTTPS. You submit that for deployment. The first thing it does is takes the resource template that is deploying on the back end, and it modifies the property for required HTTPS because your modify policy. It modifies that property to be set to true. Yes, require HTTPS is set. The next thing that happens is it goes to your deny policies and says, are there any settings on this resource that need to be blocked? But because the attribute was modified first by your modify policy, it does not block that resource because it's saying HTTPS is required. This meets my policy. Proceed. And then it creates the resource, and then post creation it would check for any audit if not exist policies that you have, and then mark it as non-compliant if something was found incorrect. So that's an illustration of policy effects happen in order based on the type of effect that's being configured in the definition of the policy. This does get a little bit in the weeds, but it's good to understand this. We're going to build on this later and probably do that live example on a resource when we get to the policy definitions video and we're actually working on creating a custom policy. Going back over the things that we covered here, let me switch back. We talked about what policies are used for, some common circumstances or common policies that might be created, and how you monitor for compliance. We went over the policy objects themselves, definitions being a single policy parameter you're trying to check for, an initiative being a collection of definitions that you have set, an assignment being an assignment of either an initiative or definition on a management group, subscription, or resource group. And then you have exemptions, which are exempting an individual resource or container from a policy, and then remediations, which are used to retroactively apply policies to objects that exist. Now, I didn't go over the details of the policy definition structure. I'll probably pull that document up in the policy definitions page, but we did talk about the effects and how that relates to when policies apply. As a reminder, policies only apply at resource creation. So when you submit the request to create that resource, that's when policy checks happen, always. And then different policies apply differently during that resource creation policy. We'll get into that again in a better example in the policy definitions video. This has been the policy overview. Next, we're going to be talking about policy management and kind of some of the day-to-day operational tasks related to Azure Policy and how you work with it.